All this talk about tariffs, but the question becomes, are we going to have a recession? And most importantly, how to recession-proof your retirement plan. Stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend and co-host Sarah Samuels. And today we're going to cover this topic about possible recession. It's been all over the news. Tariffs at a much higher level than initially suspected. What if we do get a recession? Well, it's hard to predict, but what you can do is you can take steps to protect yourself against such recession.
Dave, it's great to be here with you, of course, and with all of our listeners. I know we've had a couple shows talking about the tariffs and the possibility of recession. We talked about that last week because really it's on all of our listeners' minds. But today we're going to share how you can recession-proof your retirement plans. So, Dave, how do people get started? I think it really begins with taking some austerity measures, right? Looking at your budget.
That's right. Because look, right now, whether or not we have a recession is largely impacted by what happens with the tariffs. Do tariffs stay high with certain countries, even, some of the auto parts in China and everything? Does that cause a problem, or do they change? So instead of trying to have a crystal ball and predict that, let's do what each of us can do to protect themselves, and it starts with those austerity measures. We've had shows about this, right? Saying how even in my household, perhaps every couple of years, I'll go through and I'll look at my checkbook and I'll look at my credit card statement and all kinds of expenses and say, am I really using this, or is this a waste of money? Do I really need this? And how deep you go really depends upon your situation and how close you are to be able to live the retirement you want versus maybe you still have a gap that you need to fill.
Yep. And I think a lot of people might be wondering, well, how much do I need to cut back? And we're going to get to our question for our Ask Dave segment. But first, I want to encourage all of our listeners to call in now to the Ask Dave hotline. That phone number is 800-822-1111. And if we answer your question on a future show, we'll make sure that you get a copy of Dave's Amazon bestseller, Retirement Income Source, the ultimate guide to eternal income. So thank you, Ronald in Connecticut, who left us a voicemail with his question. And he's wondering, Dave, that he says, I understand trimming the fat, especially going into retirement, but how much should I be willing to cut back?
Okay, Ronald. Well, it depends upon your situation and your proximity. You said going into retirement, so it sounds like you're not retired. So let's start with the easy stuff, right? Let's start with the things, Ronald, that are that you're just not using anymore. So if you take a look at your credit card statement, your checking account, and there's subscriptions, credit card services, even, cable subscriptions that you're really just not using, cut those loose and see how much money you can save. That's the easy part. But then I'd recommend going to the next step, right? And if you're retired and getting income, your income that you're getting, your so-called income, might be more than, and Ronald, I know this isn't you, but if our other listeners are actually retired, you might be getting, quote, income that's actually greater than just your interest and dividends, right? And if that's the case, then, I'd go back and say, great, how much can I take from my interest and dividends? And when I add that to Social Security and a pension plan, am I okay? Or do I need to cut back further? So, Ronald, in your case, same thing. Take a look at the amount of money you have in total for retirement, multiply it by 4%, maybe 5% if you want to push it a little bit. Add to it Social Security or any pension benefit you might have or any rental income, and say, okay, can I retire on this dollar amount? Because if you can, well, then maybe you're done. You don't have to do anything more with austerity. If you can't, then maybe you need to cut back even further. And that's where you have to say, okay, how much joy am I getting from these expenses, right? There are fixed expenses, your mortgage, your property tax, your insurances, you can't do much about, but then there's your variable expenses, and how much joy do I really get out of this? Maybe I need to go out to dinner just a little bit less, or shop just a little bit less. And then you have to dig a little deeper. So, Ron, sorry for a vague answer, but the reality is it really depends upon your situation, how close you are to being financially prepared for retirement.
Ronald, thank you so much for leaving your Ask Dave hotline question. And if you have a question for Dave, we encourage you to call that hotline number. The phone line is 800-822-1111. And if we answer your question on a future show, we'll make sure that you get a copy of Dave's Amazon bestseller. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. So we know there's been a lot of talk about recession. We've heard tariffs. Recently, the U.S. government is now borrowing $2 trillion. So people are worried. People are worried about a recession, and whether Dave and I are not here to use a crystal ball to predict the future, but what we can do is talk about some austerity measures you can take now to recession-proof your retirement. And Dave, you mentioned the first step is really looking at your budget, looking at where you can cut, potentially subscriptions, potentially services. Hey, there's probably a lot of people, maybe they have a gym membership that they're not really using as much as they should. That could be an expense that you could potentially cut. But the other big part of it is making sure you're generating income the right way. That's the biggest part of it.
Well, you mentioned $2 trillion deficit, and that's interesting because, you know, the federal government is borrowing money every year. They've been doing it for decades now to pay their bills. Now, we can't do that, right? Imagine, could you pay all your expenses, your mortgage, your car payment, everything by borrowing money on a credit card? Does that work?
I don't think they'd let you do that after a while. I don't think it would work at all.
You'd hit a limit. You couldn't do it, right? And the U.S. government, in theory, can get away with it because
they have no limit, right?
The theory is, hey, you know, we're the world reserve currency. We can keep borrowing money, which is true as long as it's true, right? At some point, it may not be. But, you know, we can keep borrowing. And as long as we get enough growth where the income our countries bring, you know, the debt is a low enough percentage of the overall income, well, then we're okay. But again, you never know, even with the U.S. government, when that comes to a screeching halt. So ideally, the U.S. government would balance its budget, right? It wouldn't count on its balance sheet to pay its expenses. So think about that in a household, right? The government's no different from your house. You have a balance sheet. You have a net worth, right? You've got the value of your house, the value of your retirement savings, the value of your bank accounts, investments, minus your debt, right? That's your balance sheet.
Right.
But when you pay your regular expenses, that's on your income statement, right? So your income statement is basically the income that the two of you bring in, right? And then minus all the expenses that go out, the mortgage, the car payment, and the groceries and travel and everything.
It's almost like a business, the profit, right? You have your expenses,
That's
you
right.
have what's coming in, and then you have your profit.
But you want to keep those separate. Over time, you want to build your balance sheet, build your net worth. And so you don't even want to, your income statement needs to be positive. You don't want to spend all your income that's coming in on expenses, right? Well, the U.S. government's doing the opposite. They're essentially taking money off the balance sheet by borrowing it, increasing debt, and using it to cover those expenses because the income statement is in the red. And you know, again, may not last forever, which is why we stressed that in retirement, it's important not to do that. Because if you're living off all your income, you're spending all your income, but you're also taking some principal. If you're spending a little bit more than the income, taking some principal, and you're gambling that, hey, I probably won't live long enough to deplete all my principal, well, that's exactly what it is. It's a gamble. But the only difference is you are not the federal government. You are not the world reserve currency. You can't get away with this forever. And frankly, most likely neither can the U.S. government, right? But at this point, we can't change the U.S. government, but what we can do is hopefully get across in the rest of today's show that the most important thing in retirement is to use austerity with your expenses, but also use austerity, making sure you're spending just off your income statement and not off your balance sheet. Something more that we're going to be talking about coming up right here. I'm David Scranton with Sarah Samuels, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
Thank you for spending some time with us here on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and today we're telling you about some austerity measures that you can take now in an effort to recession-proof your retirement or your future retirement plans if you're concerned about what's going on in the economy. And Dave, we went over a few of these things, but really the ultimate thing is people need to they need to treat their household like a company. So our listeners are not necessarily financial advisors like yourself. So can we go over that income statement balance sheet again? What is that exactly?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it really, you know, my household has to be Dave Scranton Incorporated, okay? You need to be Sarah and Justin Incorporated, right? And think of it that way.
Yeah.
And with any company and any household, you have a balance sheet and you have an income statement. And again, that balance sheet is really your assets minus your liabilities. It's your net worth, right? So, if you go to a bank for a loan, they ask you for assets and liabilities sometimes on one sheet, and you have to put them all down and you subtract one from the other, and that's your net worth. But there's another sheet where they ask you all your source of income and then what are your fixed expenses, and you subtract out your mortgage and your car payment and everything. And so, over time, you'd like your balance sheet to grow.
Ideally, right?
Yeah, you want it to grow because a higher net worth could ultimately generate more income in retirement.
Right. There's more potential money that you can do things with. You can invest to generate income.
That's right. So it's, think of it that way. Think of it as, okay, here's the income that goes in my household every month. Here's the income that goes out. That's all part of your income statement. And then here's my net worth separately. My assets minus all my debts and liabilities. And the net worth could be going up, could be going down at any time, in part due to the financial markets, due to the value of your investments. But I think that's a good lesson that you brought up, is for every listener to really think about, okay, I've got these two. How do I treat myself like a business? Balance sheet and income statement. And again, the federal government, by borrowing money to pay bills, is taking money off the balance sheet to pay bills. And that's a slippery slope because, individuals can maybe get away with it even better in retirement because they're not going to live forever.
Right.
But guess what? The federal government's going to live forever. And it's a slippery slope.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into our next Ask Dave question. But first, I want to ask all of our listeners to please call in if you have questions, if you're wondering some austerity measures that you can take. We love to hear from you. All you have to do is call 800-822-1111 and leave us your name, number, and your voicemail with a question for the show. And if we answer your question on a future show, we'll make sure that you get a copy of Dave's book, The Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income. And thank you to Diane in Connecticut for sending in or calling us for your Ask Dave question. Diane says, I'm not retired yet, so how does this info really apply to me?
Well, Diane, you're at a stage in your life where hopefully your balance sheet is going up, your net worth is going up. Hopefully your income statement is positive at the end of the day. So the money going out for expenses is less than the amount of money you're bringing in, right? Hopefully that's the case. You're building for the future. And so what's happening is you, again, take all your income that comes in from work, subtract from it all your expenses, and hopefully there's something left over. Whatever's left over then goes to your balance sheet and it builds. So even if you just sit it there in your checking account or savings account, it still increases your net worth. It stays on your balance sheet. So if you utilize these austerity measures, and it's interesting, Diane, because Sarah and I have been talking about austerity measures. So you think about, okay, let's cut expenses and everything else. But why do you cut expenses? Well, you cut expenses so you have a bigger bottom line on your income statement, so that more money can go to grow the balance sheet. Not just for retirement, but Diane, what if you get laid off, right? If you get laid off, but you've got more money sitting in savings, you can endure a layoff longer, financially speaking. So austerity doesn't just mean cutting expenses, but it also means doing prudent things with the extra that's left over. So number one lesson at your stage, not being retired yet, and I don't know how far away you are, is that income statement needs to be positive. You spend less than what you make. Again, we wish we can get our politicians to do that. And then that extra goes to the balance sheet to build for a rainy day for the future, or just for the retirement you've always dreamed of. Thanks, Diane.
Diane, thank you so much for calling us and leaving us your voicemail. We'll make sure that you get a free copy of Dave's book. And if any of our listeners have a question, again, we encourage you to call the Ask Dave hotline, 800-822-1111, and leave us a voicemail with your question for the show. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And the goal of today's show is to give you some ways to recession-proof your retirement or your retirement plans if you're not in retirement, which is really what we're talking about right now. Our listeners like Diane, who are maybe a few years out of retirement, this advice still applies to you because, like Dave said, you want to make sure that you're bringing in the income, that you're increasing the balance sheet, and you're not really spending too much. You're not spending outside of your means because an emergency could happen. You could get laid off. There's all kinds of things that could happen even before you reach retirement.
Well, that's a good point. Not only are you building your reserves, in case something bad happens. But also by minimizing your expenses, let's face it, if you're unemployed, unemployment insurance doesn't usually replace your entire
Oh
paycheck.
gosh. Well,
right?
first it takes what, 6 to 8 weeks to even get it, and then it's maybe a quarter of your paycheck. It's
It takes
not
a
a
while.
great system.
It takes a while, right? So imagine if you cut your expenses back so the unemployment check actually covered all of them in an ideal scenario, right? Now you don't even have to dip into that reserve should you become unemployed. Or what if you become disabled? A lot of disability policies won't kick in for several months. You need to be able to pay your bills. And if you're disabled, you probably have higher medical bills, deductibles and co-insurances. So again, that's why keeping your monthly nut, as we call it, down to a minimum, right? So you don't have to you don't have to put out as much, and then keeping your reserves high is certainly helpful. And I think it goes down to running your finances like a family business. I love that metaphor. I really do, Sarah. Thank you.
Just like a family business. But what about for our listeners, maybe like Diane, Dave, that haven't, maybe they're worried they haven't saved enough, they don't have enough of a reserve. What are some things that they could maybe do now, like catch up contributions, things that they could do to take advantage if they haven't saved enough yet?
That's a great question. And so if you haven't saved enough, first of all, the plain austerity measures are most important, right? So cut back wherever you can. And, maybe as opposed to having a lifestyle that's at 80% of what you want and cutting down to a lifestyle that's 40% in retirement, maybe you cut back now to 60%. So you can retire with a lifestyle that's 60% of what you want. So there's no drop off. So you take those austerity measures seriously, right? But then where do you put the money? Well, it depends where you're short funded. If you're short funded on retirement and you're in a reasonable tax bracket, maybe you want to max out your 401k. Maybe if you're 50 or over, you want to do those catch-up features. 401ks, Roth IRAs, right? But what if you just have no money in savings? What if you're literally paycheck to paycheck? Maybe you're 401k rich, but you're like, what happens if I get laid off? I have to pull money out and pay a huge penalty. I don't want to do that. Well, now maybe you actually have to reduce your 401k contributions or skip a Roth IRA contribution and just build some money in savings. And I know it's not sexy and may not return as much or may not get the tax leverage, but it could also make sense because you need that cash reserve. And it's like emergency fund is like in baseball. It's a sacrifice bunt, right? With a sacrifice bunt, you're probably going to get thrown out. So why do you intentionally do it? Well, you do it because it's better for the team. You advance the runners, right? So sometimes saving money in the bank at very little interest is, it's not great for that one pool of money, but it's better for the team. It's like a sacrifice bunt.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about folks that are currently working or maybe heading into retirement. But what if you're already retired? How can you take austerity measures in your own retirement plans, and how can you really make sure that you're getting the income that you need to have a successful retirement? We'll discuss that coming up. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you've been listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. You've been listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And a lot of our listeners have been concerned about the possibility of a recession, especially with news of tariffs every single day. So today we're talking about ways that you can install some austerity measures in your own retirement plans, or if you're planning to retire. So Dave, we've talked about some of the different things that people can do to recession-proof their retirement, but it's really about playing a defensive game too. So what are some of the other things our listeners could really do now if they want to make sure that they're taking advantage of all of these different austerity measures?
Sure, we talked about minimizing your expenses so that you have more left over on your income statement. If you view yourself as a corporation, that can help you build your balance sheet. But sometimes it's not just today. You have to look ahead. So you've got to say, okay, if I've got credit card debts, I have to figure out how to pay those off. Maybe refinancing those in a second mortgage might make sense. Plan to get your car loans paid. I know Americans seem to think that, gosh, I'm always going to have a car loan, just the nature of life, or a car lease or a car payment. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. If you plan ahead to get your car paid off and you drive it for a while, you could actually save up money, transfer money from the income statement to your balance sheet to have cash so you could pay cash for your next car so you don't have to have a car payment, right? Sarah, I know one of the things a lot of people want to do when they get into retirement is downsize their house.
Right. That's something usually a goal for a lot of people, especially if they have a big house, big family. You might want to downsize to a condo or something a little bit more manageable.
Now, some people don't because they have enough retirement assets. I don't care. But if you do, if you're close in retirement and saying, I wish I had a little more flexibility, maybe do that downsize a few years early so that your mortgage balance goes down, your mortgage payment goes down. You can get even that paid off in retirement. Because remember, retirement's not just about offense and how much income you make, it's also defense, keeping your expenses down. Because enjoyment of retirement comes to that net positive on the income statement, right? How much income you have left over after you've paid all your fixed expenses. Because that income left over is what allows you to go out to dinner with your friends, to travel, to go have fun. So if all of your retirement income is soaked up with fixed expenses, well, then you're going to have not a great retirement.
Right. And that's not our goal here. We want to make sure that all of our listeners have a great retirement and that you have enough income to enjoy your retirement. I want to encourage everyone to reach out. Again, if you have a question, if you haven't called our Ask Dave hotline, we would love to hear from you. That phone number is 800-822-1111. Leave us a voicemail with your question for the show. And if we answer your question on a future show, we'll make sure that you get a free copy of Dave's book, Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income. Our next question comes from Craig in Connecticut. He says, Dave, I'm retired and we're spending within our income. We feel okay. Does that mean that we are okay?
All right, Craig, great question. But it depends about how you're defining the word income. So there's three definitions for the word income. There is cash flow, right? How much money your financial advisor is sending you on a monthly basis. Then there's the IRS's definition for the word income. If all of your income is coming from a 401k withdrawal or IRA withdrawal, well, then you get a 1099, and that's the IRS's definition of income because you have to pay tax on it. But then there's the investment-related definition of income. How much of your investment return is coming from interest or dividends? And Craig, this last definition is the one that matters most when it comes to not outliving your money, right? Now, we talked about the U.S. government, how they are borrowing $2 trillion a year just to pay the expenses. And some affluent people do this. There are many billionaires that have a lot of appreciated stock, and they don't want to sell that stock because if they do, they have to pay capital gains. If they die with the stock, that capital gain gets forgiven. It's a tax loophole. So they'll borrow every year against the stock and pay some interest and spend those proceeds. They're living off their balance sheet intentionally because they're making a judgment call or a guess that, hey, I'll die before I deplete this, right? They might be correct, but it's still a gamble. But realize these are billionaires we're talking about, not millionaires, billionaires. So now you come in and say, okay, I've got a certain life expectancy, right, Craig? And I don't know what that is. So how much am I getting from just income? How much am I getting from interest and dividends? Because if that's your definition of income and you're only spending that, well, then that's great. Because if you don't take any principal, then you really can't run out of money, right? It's almost impossible. You have to mess up pretty badly with investment decisions. So think about it. If you're not getting your cash flow from interest and dividends, that means you're taking it out of principal. And if you take it out of principal, then next year, what happens to your interest and dividends? That's right, it goes down because you have less principal, so now your interest and dividends goes down, which means next year you have to take even more principal, and it becomes a slippery slope. And this is why a few decades ago, the federal government was borrowing, $100 billion a year, and now it's borrowing $2 trillion a year. Same kind of mathematics in reverse. So I hope you can stay tuned for the rest of our show because we're going to really hammer this concept home for the next few minutes. Craig, I hope that helped.
Craig, thank you so much for calling the Ask Dave hotline. Again, that phone number is 800-822-1111. Please give us a call. Leave us a voicemail with your Ask Dave question. We would love to hear from you. You've been listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we've been covering different ways that you can really recession-proof your personal finances, whether you're a few years from retirement or already in retirement. And Dave, we just answered a question from Craig where he says, hey, I feel good. I feel like I'm living off my income. I don't feel like I'm spending too much. Am I really okay? And I think you brought up a great point, which is that if you're living off the principal, it might feel okay right now, but you're not doing okay. And I think some of our listeners might be confused about, where is the income on the principal on the sheet, right? Because a lot of people get those sheets and it feels like, oh, this is the check I'm getting, this is income, but really it's because their advisor is selling their shares and selling their principal to generate that money. It's
Well,
not income.
it's confusing because there are
Yeah.
3 different definitions of income, and the IRS definition is one. Even if you take principal out of an IRA or 401k, it's called income by the IRS, right? And the IRS can't be wrong, you think, right?
Never.
But also, your advisor. Your advisor is sending you a check. You're getting a check in the mail. You spend it. That's to you. That's income, right? But do you know where it's coming from, right? Imagine if your employer sent you a check and you didn't know how much of it was actual earnings that you earned versus how much of it they were taking out of your 401k.
Right.
Well, now it's like you wouldn't know how much you can spend because you'd only want to spend what you're earning. You wouldn't want to spend your 401k proceeds.
Right. I'm not getting a clear picture.
And some financial advisors do this. They'll send you the check and you don't know how much it is. So the key here is to think of that income. Don't think about how much your account went up last year. Think about the actual interest and dividends. So Sarah, the way I like to look at that is it's like real estate, right? You can make money in real estate 2 ways. Number one, it can go up in value. And if you buy just raw land or speculative property, that's the only way to make money. It's got to go up in value and you have to sell it, right?
I lose that asset after I sell it.
That's called capital appreciation. You have to sell it to get that gain. The second way is to rent it out and get rental income. When you get rental income, you don't have to sell anything because you get checks in the mail every month and you can cash those checks and do whatever you want with it. So I think the important thing here is, you might get growth on your money, but where's that growth coming from? Is it coming from interest and dividends that gets paid out to you, like that rental income? Or is it just capital appreciation where you literally have to sell it in order to get the proceeds? And there's a big difference.
Absolutely, Dave. Well, we appreciate you spending some time here with us on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
And we certainly hope that you're here with us next week, same time, same station. I'm David Scranton here at Sarah Samuels, and yes, this is the Retirement Income Source, where it is all about the income.